Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel webinar titled Weatherproofing NATO's Future, Coming Considerations for Climate Security. My name is Alexander Landry, and I am a young fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, which is exhilarated today to be hosting the webinar here. So today we have the opportunity to delve into a critical issue at the intersection of global security and environmental challenges. We'll be looking at climate security within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization against the backdrop of NATO's recently established Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence. We're going to explore how the alliance is adapting its mandate and strategies to address the evolving threats posed by climate change. To this effect, we have brought forward a talented and seasoned group of experts and stakeholders for this discussion. Throughout this discussion, we're going to examine the prism through which NATO views the relationship between the likes of climate security. We'll speak of energy and relevant geopolitical challenges, from Russia to the Arctic. We'll also specifically address Canada's pivotal role in driving NATO's climate security initiatives forward, including Ottawa's current strategic contributions on this front. So as we navigate this complex and pressing issue, I encourage our panelists here to engage in thoughtful dialogue and exchange of ideas. I anticipate exploring the opportunities and challenges ahead, especially in considering how NATO can further mitigate and adapt to climate change and facing climate-related security threats. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into the discussion today. I'm excited to hear from our esteemed panelists and to explore the path forward for NATO in addressing these security challenges. So with me to discuss these topics are Pauline Baudu, Bruno Charbonneau, Paul Rushton, and Mathieu Bussière. Pauline is a senior fellow at Arctic 360, a non-resident research fellow at the Center for Climate and Security, and a fellow at the Conference of Defense Associations Institute. Bruno is a professor and director of the Center for Security and Crisis Governance at the Royal Military College Saint-Jean and the founding president of the Climate Security Association of Canada. Paul is a former first secretary for the Canadian Joint Delegation to NATO and currently an officer for climate change and security at NATO headquarters. And Mathieu is the director of the newly founded NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence based in Montreal. I'm delighted to have you all join me for this webinar with the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy today. Thank you and welcome aboard. So as a lead off, I just want to set the scene a little bit in terms of domain of climate security and what the topics mean to you within the purview of your current work. I know each of you have been deeply involved in climate security for some time and in many different ways, as well as intersectionally and tangentially. So accordingly, I'd like an introduction in what brought you into the world of climate security and what keeps you working within it today. So I'll start with Paul, please.
Thank you. And first of all, just my appreciation for participating in the panel today. I am looking forward to the discussion as much as I imagine all of your guests and the audience members are. For me, I'll take you on a brief but quite roundabout journey. And I say roundabout because there were a lot of things that brought me to the climate change and security issue, but it was both indirect and in retrospect, weirdly inevitable. I spent a lot of my early career immediately after graduation working with NGOs on environmental rights issues in conflict-affected states, Burma and Nepal, and eventually started doing some work managing sustainable agriculture in Darfur during the civil war there, and focusing on how conflict-affected communities view environmental issues. And it's funny, as I imagine everybody on the panel agrees, once you start thinking about these issues, once you start looking at security in environmental terms, you never really stop. And so even when my career led me in a different direction for a decade or so into first diplomacy and then deterrence and arms control, I still found myself always thinking, how is the environment affecting the incentives of the different actors? What's the climate piece of this deterrence and land conflict issue? What are the trade-offs and the hidden challenges that are linked to the environment? Because that's the way you start to think when you start looking at these issues. And end result of that was that I went back to school to get a master's degree in the subject. And when NATO in 2021 really massively increased its ambition on climate change and agreed the Climate Change and Security Action Plan and has been building on it in the years since, I, by happy accident, happened to be within the organization and had spent many years thinking about how climate and security intersect with each other. Not just in the environments that I've been working in the Sahel and elsewhere in so-called vulnerable or fragile states, but how it affects European security and the countries that we think of as being less vulnerable. So I, as said, by happy accident, was here when NATO really built up its ambition. I've had the privilege of coming over to contribute to the work. And to be honest, and to answer the question about what keeps me in this area, it's really simple, and I think it'll come as we go forward. It's just the biggest and the most complicated and yes, the most fascinating security issue in the world. Climate change and security, there's nothing like it because everything else is tied into it. And so for me, I wouldn't want to work anywhere else, any other area of security policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. I do appreciate that, and I can definitely understand the mention of fragile states and the different areas that climate change does affect. Speaking to that, I know that Pauline is very well implicated within the Arctic discussion for that. So, Pauline, I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself and what brings you to climate security.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning or afternoon to everyone, and thank you also for the invitation, Alex. It's an honor talking about this topic today and sharing this panel with such esteemed colleagues. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion too. So for me, my first professional background was for about 10 years in human rights and migrations, so refugee law. And in particular, I worked as an analyst for the French jurisdiction processing asylum claims, which was my day-to-day work for like more than 5 years. And in this context, I kind of saw firsthand through the many refugee stories that I was reading and hearing every day, how climate change affects and shapes in many ways, many complex ways, the reasons why some people need to leave their country, really the rationale that leads them to make this decision because their livelihoods have been affected or because of security risks per se. So that is really what brought me to wanting to study this nexus a little more, the climate and security nexus. So first through this prism of climate migrations. And then I also connected it to my other research interests, which has been the geopolitical and security dynamics of the Arctic, which sounds remote from migrations, but it's not, and it's connected in many ways. And I really wanted to understand the climate security nexus there too, both because Arctic security itself is, has been at the forefront of discussions, as we know. It's changing very rapidly, but also because of the region's extreme vulnerability to climate change too, which it's distinct but also interconnected. So I've worked for a few years in the policy world on these topics for different think tanks, and I still do. And more recently, I've also started a PhD, as Bruno knows, because he's my supervisor, and to complement this policy perspective that I've developed with a more academic perspective. So what keeps me working on climate security is that opportunity to build on these different perspectives that I've developed throughout my young career and integrate my experience in human rights into my research, but particularly looking at how climate change affects human security, which I think is still an overshadowed topics in the climate security conversations, and how these impacts on human security are actually very much interconnected with more traditional threats on national security. They actually mutually feed each other. And yes, and it's also very excited to be, working on these topics now because there's a real impetus with NATO's climate security efforts, and you can really feel that the climate security community and work are expanding and diversifying. So lots of new ways to look at it and lots of new platforms to advance work on the topic.
Great, thank you so much. And the mention of human security is one I hope we can further discuss later in the panel. Your mention of NATO's obviously growing interest in climate security is big. So I'll pivot here to Mathieu because, quite frankly, he's one of the major reasons we're here for the webinar today with CASCO's foundation, essentially, in growth. So Mathieu, I'm very excited to hear about your entry in climate security and what's keeping you in it outside of CASCO itself.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Thank you for the invitation and the great introduction. And I think you have a nice set of presenters and panelists today, because we are all dealing with the same issues, but we have slightly different backgrounds. And in my case, I've been in the defense policy world for 20 years, and I've been a little bit everywhere. I've been to NATO, working with Paul, but also went to operational commands, as well as the National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa. climate and environment has always been part of our work in the defense policy realm. Maybe a slightly different approach back then, but we were looking at how the Canadian forces and armed forces in general are responding to climate-related incidents and events, and how we're supporting civilian authorities in dealing with them. Less perhaps about adapting or mitigating the effects of climate change. But nonetheless, this was central to our discussions. In operational commands, the impact that responding to these events have on readiness of forces and the kind of equipment that need to be procured to give the forces not only the chance to be of service to the society, but also to be able to do the job they're actually paid for, which is warfare. So a lot of questions over the last decades about this, and the questions that we're facing right now are not that different from the same problems we had earlier. But what's different is, and I think Paul mentioned that the urgency since 2021. The climate security issues really went in hyperdrive anyway in a NATO context, and that's why today I'm in this position as director of the Center of Excellence on Climate Change and Security. I've been in Brussels for the last 4 years, participating in putting this project on rail, and also making sure that all other activities at NATO have a little bit of an inject on climate security. But for me, going forward, I think we're at we reach a state of normality, and maybe it's because I'm talking about climate security every day and climate change pretty much every day. But the impact of climate change, I think, is undisputable. Our societies are changing. We are asked as individuals to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Legal frameworks are put in place. The industries have to follow them. There's big, deep political commitments throughout the international community to face the challenges of climate change. So it's only natural for the defense institutions and the armed forces to do the same. So for me, we're in the normal transformation pattern, and I certainly hope that the center will be able to support and help in this transformation.
Great, thank you very much for that. And it's great to see, especially like with the growth of the COE and whatnot, specifically it being Montreal too. And tangentially to that, obviously, we've brought Bruno aboard as a panelist here, the founding president of the Climate Security Association of Canada, also in Montreal. Bruno, welcome aboard, and I'm excited to hear a little bit about your background and what brings you into climate security as well, outside of just advising for Pauline's PhD.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity. I'm very happy to be with you and my colleagues here today. Well, in my case, I guess I've always had like a personal interest in environmental climate issues, but never worked professionally on it until 2017-18. My professional, I guess my PhD thesis on West African conflict dynamics and international intervention. And back in 2017-18, I started noticing a rise of narratives about climate change and security in the Sahel. I was very intrigued by that. What was happening there was coming from very specific places, like especially from Europe, about the Sahel. And so it got me really thinking about trying to figure out why suddenly in 2017, I think people were interested in connecting climate change and conflict in the Sahel. And so I started writing climate sciences, reading climate science more thoroughly. As much as I could. I read everything I could. Like Paul said, once you start, you never stop. You never stop thinking about these things. And so I almost immediately made that decision that my research and work in the future would be about climate change and obviously things connecting it to security, humanitarian emergencies, and so on and so forth, as I was doing in the Sahel. And so that led me to try to organize a conference in 2019 that was supposed to happen early to 2020, but then COVID happened. So, but that was sort of a lucky key thing, because once we were able to do it, Canada had announced and NATO had announced CASCO. So it sort of gave us a little bit of momentum, and we made new friends and whatnot. And last year, as you know, we launched also the CSAC, so the Climate Security Association of Canada, which is to us, me and Canadian colleagues, a platform or an association, bring people together, a community that wants to discuss these issues, because basically I think there's much to be done there, especially in Canada, to bring up and bring people together, support students and newcomers, newcomers. She's been around for a while, Pauline, but certainly for the next generation, to talk about these issues and work on these issues. And to me, it's quite obvious why I keep working on it, because it needs to be done. There is an urgency. I think we shouldn't shy from saying it. It needs to be done. It needs to be done yesterday. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'll do my best to contribute to the effort.
Okay, thank you. And really, as a follow-up to that and speak to that security piece, it's evident that everyone does come from different backgrounds, but it shares common themes in terms of approaches to climate security. And I'm glad Metzer mentioned that. So to provide a little insight to that based on experience, Pauline, could you speak to us a little about the intersection about climate change and security threats as we see them today? I know we talked about fragility of states, and you mentioned human security. I'm interested to hear your piece as a follow-up to Bruno's, and then we'll speak more a little bit about the Alliance specifically.
Sure. So thank you. It's actually an interesting question, because it may sound like, it's the very basis of the climate security work, understanding this interaction between climate change and security, yet not everybody agrees on the answer. Not on the fact that the physical impacts of climate change are real and that they have security consequences. This is pretty well established, not debated, at least within this climate security community. But what's debated is the scope of these security impacts, which impacts should be prioritized, and the framing we should use when talking about them. And one reason for this is that there is a lot of uncertainty about what the security risk landscape, will look like in the future. And these climate security risks are also very different from one geographical area to another. And they also depend on the timescale that we're looking at. The answer varies if we're speaking short-term, medium-term, long-term. And finally, the level of risk will also ultimately depend on the efficiency of the efforts that we are as humans are willing to make, the efficiency of our own policies, both to mitigate our climate impact and to adapt to these impacts. And these last parameters, which are contingent upon human action and policy efficiency, are also very uncertain. But beyond future risks, to still answer your question, we're obviously already witnessing very tangible security risks from climate change today, and we've been for a while. The primary impacts are on human security, because climate change profoundly affects the health, the livelihoods, food, water security, the culture of many communities across the world. And then from a security and defense perspective, which may be especially of interest to NATO in particular, climate change is reshaping the very operational and strategic environments within which military forces operate. First, it affects military bases and infrastructure due to sea level rise, wildfires, storms, extreme events which threaten installations and undermine military readiness. And this is not new. This is something we've been witnessing for a while, both domestically. So I work for a US-based think tank, the Center for Climate and Security, and they've been working on the topic for years now, how bases needed to be completely rebuilt after some hurricanes, and others are sinking. You have the Norfolk base, which is one of the main assets within the US and also for NATO, which is sinking due to sea level rise and coastal erosion. So that's a huge challenge. And climate change is also changing the nature of the missions and the frequency of military operations. with troops that are increasingly deployed to respond to climate-related disasters, also both domestically and abroad. So this is really straining troops and affecting readiness. And then climate change also contributes to shaping the geopolitical landscape. And this is perhaps the most debated of all these points as to the exact role that climate change is playing in geopolitical dynamics. It might exacerbate the risk of conflict by compounding pre-existing local vulnerabilities. It's not acting, in a siloed way. So it's really compounding local vulnerabilities, but there are also more sophisticated threats, which can take many forms, like the risks of geoengineering techniques, what they can bring and how to govern them on a global level, or the weaponization of climate disinformation by information and disinformation by some countries, which can destabilize or discredit others. So these are, both anticipatory risks, like when we do climate foresight, we think about these risks, we try to integrate these risks in wargaming, ideally. But this is also, it's not only in the future, it's also trends that we're increasingly witnessing. So to refer to these impacts of climate change on security risks, the framing that has commonly been used by policymakers originating from the US and then which is also used by NATO and has become a kind of working definition for climate security, is that climate change is a threat multiplier, which means that climate change has the potential to interact with other pre-existing security risks and drivers of instability and to exacerbate them. And it's a term that has largely participated in framing how we think about these issues by highlighting the very systemic nature of climate risks, and to move away from siloed thinking, really acknowledging that all of these are, like, actless and more traditional threats are interconnected. And it has guided the creation and emergence of the climate security community. It has contributed to advancing the progressive interaction of climate change into military planning, but the term also has its critiques. So as we're advancing, in how to think and address like these risks, especially in academia, you have also, and that's very interesting, you have conceptual developments, because this term threat multiplier is seen as putting too much emphasis on traditional security concepts, not enough on the human dimension. It's debated, it's debatable. Perhaps also not enough emphasis on the need to curb military emissions. So yes, you have new conceptual developments emerging to help frame the topic and debates, and some of which put a stronger focus not only on the security of states from climate change, but also on humans and of ecosystems themselves, and on the need to understand specific contexts at the local level to guide policy action. So yes, this is like where we are now, kind of on the understanding of this climate security nexus.
Of course, thank you for that quite detailed rundown. And I'm really glad you've mentioned mitigation adaptation, as well as where the security dilemma really comes into play now. So obviously NATO is a big part of that, and the climate security community has now been rising within NATO. So I'd like to hear from Mathieu and Paul, respectively, specifically from Center of Excellence, but also from NATO HQ, of where NATO comes into play as an alliance on climate security, and kind of how we're moving forward in terms since 2021 specifically on those lines of effort.
I'll let Paul speak first. I think the NATO aspects are foundational to what we do here at the center. So I think for people listening in, that will help put things in context.
Thanks, Mathieu, and thanks to Pauline for a very useful foundation that really will, I think, inform the rest of our discussion. Look, the language that NATO used to describe climate change is out there in our 2022 strategic concept, which sets out the mission of the alliance. We called it a defining strategic challenge defining security challenge for the 21st century, which it absolutely is, but that's kind of a necessary but insufficient framing all by itself, because we have a world full of enormous security challenges. We have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has really upended our understanding of what conflict in, at least in the Euro-Atlantic area, looks like in the current century. The threat of terrorism and asymmetric warfare and risks tied to instability around NATO's periphery, that hasn't gone away. It's still one of the core threats that we attempt to address. We have the disruptive effects of innovation and cyber conflict, and we have the rise of strategic competition, including with China. And I do often get asked that against all of these challenges, why is NATO paying attention to climate change? Which, thankfully, I do get that question less and less, but there's a very good answer, and that's because climate change affects all of those issues, both what they look like and how they behave in the world, and how NATO can respond to all of those different security challenges. Because fundamentally, it's making the world more dangerous in all the ways that Putin has described, and we as a security-focused alliance have to respond to the way that climate change is making fragile and vulnerable places more fragile and more vulnerable, particularly through the intermediating mechanism of its effects on human security and livelihoods. It also makes our operating environments for NATO forces and our equipment more difficult. Our forces are operating in hotter, drier, dustier environments more affected by extreme weather, and that's affecting their ability to do their jobs. And as Putin has mentioned, they're increasingly called upon to respond to natural disasters and support humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts, even as they are also building up our deterrence and defense posture to counter the threat posed by Russia. It strains our critical infrastructure, both military and civilian, and our supply chains in ways that make it harder to ensure the prosperity of a civilian economy and the effectiveness of a military operation. Just put simply, it makes everything that we at NATO do as a military alliance harder. And so dealing with climate change, understanding it, adapting to it, mitigating our contribution to it is not a distraction from global security challenges. It's an investment in our ability to deal with those challenges and the ability to ensure that our troops remain effective, that our deterrence and defense posture remains credible and sound. And that's the ambition that the allies have really laid out for themselves in 2021 when they agreed the NATO Climate Change and Security Action Plan, and as they've continued to reinforce it and up our level of ambition since then. In the interests of time, I'll only cover that very briefly, but we agreed to ourselves that we'd have 4 pillars of our action plan. 1 is understanding climate change and its effects on our security. 2 is adapting to it, particularly adapting to the effect that it has on our military forces and the resilience of our societies. 3rd is mitigating it, reducing the military footprint in greenhouse gases. And 4th is all of our partnerships and outreach work. Everything that we do with our huge network of partner countries and international organizations and industry and academia. We've continued to amplify this work and look for ways to really mainstream it into the foundation of all of our military and political activities. I'm happy to get into that in some depth, but I think this is a fantastic point from Matthew to speak to the ways that the center is beginning to support the work of NATO as an institution and its network of participating countries.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Paul. Just took notes not to let you speak first anymore. So just to clarify, and I'm happy to talk about CASCO and its role, later in this webinar. But one thing's for sure is that I'm not representing NATO. I'm representing 12 nations that have decided to put their resources together to develop a specific expertise on climate change and security. So, as much as I am trying to help NATO enterprise, and not only at HQ where Paul lived, but also at the Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk and Allied Command Operations in SHAPE, we are an independent organization that is being asked to support nations and NATO in defining the challenges that are related to climate change. And one of the things that is clear to me is that this should not be taken in silo. And I know that when we have those webinars and we're all talking, and specifically talking about climate change and climate security, it seems like we are trying to separate it from the bigger picture. And as Paul said, from our perspective anyway, this is part of the mix. There are other priorities. There are short-term priorities, others that are longer in time. And I talked about the transformation efforts in the introduction, and I think that's the point that needs to be drilled in, is that we will not convince political leadership and military leadership to treat climate change or climate security as a one-off, as a standoff from all the other issues that they have to deal with. So the importance for us is making sure that the points that were raised by Pauline and Paul specifically, be included in the bigger picture, as we did several times in the past, that when we transform our military tools and institutions, we take in consideration some of the challenges that are brought by climate change. And Paul talked about our platforms. He talked about our infrastructures, but I think the scope is even wider than this. From our perspective, it does affect both the tactical, operational, and strategic levels at the same time, but differently. The tactical, the soldiers on the deployed on operations do feel the impact of climate change. They do feel it differently from the commanders that are taking decisions from a military plan perspective, and they definitely feel it differently from the strategic leadership that take big decisions on resources and acquisitions over the long term. So all these things, we hope we can analyze and take the best of the behaviors that have been noticed, witnessed, thought about, analyzed recently and in the future, and be able to share that knowledge with the rest of the community. I would also talk about the processes, because and NATO has a bunch of it, nations as well. And in our discussions with our sponsoring nations, we've understood that they're already thinking about how to inject that climate security aspects into the way they develop their criteria for acquisition of different type of equipments, but also on the way that they're training and educating their personnel. And that's where also we hope that the center can be of added value. We have, what we in the military parlance, we have doctrines and standards that all are really the foundation of how the military operates. And that's one of the things that we will look at. And again, it's not to develop a parallel thinking on how to approach climate security, but make sure that we inject at the right time, at the right level, the right information to ensure that when we transform our armed forces to deal with the challenges of the future, and not only the ones that are related to climate, not the ones that are only exacerbated by climate, but others as well, that we were fully cognizant of the impact of climate change, and be deliberate, which is not always the case when we've seen the transformation cycles in the past, but deliberate on the way that we're preparing our forces for the future. One of the recent discussions I had was with the medical team in the Canadian Armed Forces, and that's also very, very interesting discussions, because the individuals within our ranks are also deeply affected by climate change. We're talking about, I was talking about the role of assisting civilian authorities. Well, this is more and more frequent, and more puts pressure on the women and men in the armed forces. It changes their cycle of training. It changes their cycle of preparing for what they thought was their job, and now it's something different. It puts additional pressure, as I said, on readiness levels. And it creates also a different kind of working and operating environment, not only from a psychological perspective, but also from a very physical perspective, where some environments are warmer, but also there's different injuries that you could that are related to a changing operation environment. So, these are the questions that we certainly will look at in the course of our work here at the center. And we could go as wide or as narrow as we want, depending on, again, the requirements that are stemming out of the work that is being done by Paul at NATO, but also in our national capitals and defense headquarters on how they want to, on one side, adapt to the changes of climate change, but also, and I think we've raised it, but maybe not enough, how do we want to mitigate and reduce the carbon footprint of the activities that are related to the military. It's not only coming up with new technologies that will reduce the emission, but it's also changing some of our ways of doing business. The military we hear of no-fail missions, and no-fail missions generally do come with no boundaries on resources and support. And maybe now it's time to have a more realistic look on how we deal with our logistic chains and how we actually interoperate between each other, especially in the NATO context. So a lot of things to talk about, and I'm really excited about the next few years. And as Bruno said, yeah, there is a factor of urgency to it, but we also have to be cognizant of the own limits of what a governmental instrument can achieve within the time frame that is given to us. So, I'm really looking forward to talking more about this, not only in this webinar, but in all the other platforms I'm participating in.
Of course, thank you. And I'm really glad that you made that distinction for CASCO specifically in terms of support to NATO and not as a NATO entity per se, because I think that that's one that can be misconstrued quite often. And it's important to understand like the whole larger community for climate security. And definitely, as you mentioned, this this forms the basis for conferences and discussions and workshops and working groups, more than just the 1 hour webinar we do have today. That being said, one of the nations that is partaking, obviously, is the framework nation for CASCO, recently established in Montreal, and that's Canada. And I'd like to hear from Bruno on what Canada's role in the alliance is specific to climate change. And this is also part of the finicky piece of the webinar here, where we kind of pivot off course a little bit, because after that, Paul's going to speak to us a little bit how NATO is going to look to institutionalize climate change and security more across the alliance moving forward. So, Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I'm not speaking of the Canadian government, just to be clear here.
Of course, thank you.
First, I think many people have been working on climate change for decades, as I'm sure the audience here knows. But the field of climate security, and by that I mean the academic field of climate security, but also the policy space is very young. So I think that it's important to say that these are very early days for the practice of climate security. And there is so much to do. And in my opinion as well, there is very limited certainty or agreement about where to do or prioritize the work. So I just want to state that to start with. And two challenges, I think, make it even harder. Very quickly, climate literacy. I see it on a regular basis. What I mean by that is the basics of what climate change is. Before you talk about security consequences, you need to know a bit about climate change per se. I think that's changing. It will definitely change. And evolve very quickly, especially with CASCO, I hope anyway. But it's still a challenge in some circles. And the other challenge I would say is, and Paul and both Paul and Mathieu and Pauline have sort of pointed at it, and you've probably all read that concept these days, the polycrisis. So it is intertwined. Climate change is intertwined with all sorts of other crises going on out there. So the short-term crisis management versus the long-term implementation issues and strategy that is needed for climate security, I think sometimes can collide, and we need to figure out a way to make them work together. So these, to me, changes are important. They're in line because, I think climate change transforms everything, it's not helpful to say that from a policy or practical perspective. And so for organizations like NATO or the Canadian Armed Forces or Global Affairs Canada, for instance, I think they're still trying to figure out how to integrate and operationalize climate security. So there is now a recognition that climate change affects security, but its actual practical, if you will, means of what does that actually mean for policy and for government action is something else. What does it mean to do and achieve climate security? How do you institutionalize it? And the answer also cannot be universal. It cannot be the same for the Canadian Armed Forces, for Global Affairs Canada, Government Canada, or for NATO, for instance. So with that in mind, what can Canada do and with and within the alliance? Well, the first step, I think, is and was CASCO. I think that the establishment of CASCO is one giant step in the right direction. I think the center already has created all sorts of momentum in all sorts of places. I see it mainstreaming, at the very least, the discussion about climate security, and also already creating collaborations and building bridges between different actors and communities. And I suspect that this will grow, obviously. And I think that if CASCO can serve, and I think it will, Mathieu will correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's the objective here. If it can serve as a hub for research, training, education, all things related to climate security, that will already be a very significant Canadian contribution to the alliance. And so on this basis, Canada can and should have an essential impact here on NATO's climate security agenda, if only because it is the leading nation behind the CASCO. However, beyond that, I think that Canada will need to lead by example. What I mean by that is the government of Canada will need to mitigate and adapt to climate change. I think Canada will need to insert climate security into all sorts of other things, like its foreign policy, its defense policy, and so on and so forth. What does that mean, inserting it? I think that's the key issue. What does it mean to integrate climate change into foreign policy or defense policy is a key question. And arguably, not much yet has been achieved as far as I'm concerned. There are positive signs, like the Defense Climate and Sustainability Strategy that was published last December, that seeks to organize activities around climate action and environmental sustainability. The latest defense document, of course, Our North, Strong and Free, emphasizes the challenges of climate change, albeit with a focus to the consequences for the Canadian Arctic. I think the test will be to turn these words into action, these documents into action, to implement the strategies that are identified in these documents to achieve climate security. And I think that this is where Canada could play the biggest role within NATO, show how it's done, how to do climate security. And it's really by doing it that will define what climate security is. So, I mean, I'm sure you're aware, and we'll probably talk about it a lot this coming summer, but forest fires and disaster response in Canada, we should do it. Canadian Armed Forces, obviously, are spread thin here, and the increasing demands to respond to such things like the forest fires last summer, and what's coming this summer, I think should definitely be addressed, and very quickly.
Of course, thank you for that. And Canada also does contribute, of course, to the different pieces like the Compendium of Best Practices. It's looking at the collection of alliance-wide efforts on climate change adaptations, things like energy efficiency, sustainable technology, and innovations for climate-related capability requirements. We've seen presentations, and there's been discussion at large before on the greenhouse gas emissions mapping and analytical methodology, and that's a piece, and it's following up with a question actually from the chat that we had about AI and new technologies. But that being said, I'll leave it to the expert, and I'd love to hear from Paul a little more on that and the institutionalization of climate change and security within NATO specifically, understanding that as a curveball a little bit for you here on this platform.
No problem. So the great thing about, talking about what our next steps can be is that it's already underway, and there's a lot that we're doing to institutionalize this work. And the bad thing is that there is a lot to do, and this is going to be the project of many years, but I suppose that's what it is when you're facing an epochal security challenge. When you talk about institutionalizing, I think what we really lean on is mainstreaming, and that's the idea of how we begin to incorporate climate considerations into every relevant part of what this alliance does, which basically means everything that we do. And that means, how do we bring climate considerations into our exercises, military exercises, and our training, and showing the ways that climate is going to affect operational decision-making. How do we affect, and I think Matthew has pointed towards our standards work. How does it affect the technical and material standards that we have, for example, for how in-air refueling is supposed to work, or how the seal on a medical tent is supposed to work? And how is that going to change in a hotter, drier, dustier environment, for example? Our doctrines, the ways that our military strategies are translated into operational guidance for forces in the field, are going to have to adjust to the new environment. And the way we plan and procure our defense capabilities needs to reflect the new operating conditions. And rather than dive into specific examples of what all of that means, I think what I drive at is, you need an understanding always of how to make all of those things relevant to the exact person that you're talking to, and how it ties into the mission that they are tasked with accomplishing. Certainly that's the way we look at it at NATO. I think Matthew had the right of it when he said you need to get the right info at the right level at the right time. And that is absolutely the case for us. So for example, look at a helicopter pilot who is flying in the context of, say, NATO mission Iraq, who finds that her chopper doesn't get the lift it used to because hotter air supports less lift for rotary wing aircraft, or a CBRN soldier who is used to wearing a full body protective suit, but that's hot and difficult to wear under the very best of circumstances. And now they're expected to wear it when it's 37 degrees and torrential rain. Or a liaison officer in a field mission who is seeing the impacts on human security from climate change in the communities that they're supposed to be working with. And when we say you need to mainstream climate change, it means you need to zero in on what each individual portion of the alliance, each mission, each operational domain, each soldier, each person has to do to accomplish their mission, and then look at how climate change is making that harder, and look at how you can support them in adapting to those challenges and continuing to fulfill their objectives. And that's going to mean training and exercises, doctrines, standards, equipment, awareness across every imaginable level. I don't want to neglect the mitigation piece. We've launched an ambitious mitigation program called the Energy Transition by Design, which is meant to both align us with the ongoing green energy transition and help our militaries adapt to it. It's absolutely critical. These are, between the two of them, mitigation and adaptation, two parallel, intertwined, and yet very distinct lines of work that have to be mainstreamed across everything that we do. Thank you.
No, thanks, Paul. It's key, and I think the discussion and development of the actual lessons learned that we've just discussed there, that you actually outlined, there, are really good, because it fosters into the actual concrete examples that are part of the discussion. It's not just the theoretical and the academic piece, which really puts it into place and provides that framework for us to understand it, especially from the tactical military level. Segueing from that, though, just as we do near the end here, I'd love to hear from Matthew a little bit more about CASCO's work leading into the Washington Summit this year, and what the next little while looks like for CASCO as it gets off the ground here at FOC.
No, thank you, Alex. So obviously we're a very young organization. We started, and we're still, technically in initial operating capacity, if you will. We started in October last year in Dorval, and we were 3, and now we're 14. And hopefully by the end of the summer, we will reach our full operating capacity, and at maturity, the center is set for 33 positions. Half of them being from sponsoring nations. So we're talking about families and personnel that are coming from other countries to come and be located in Montreal with us and in our offices. So quite the multicultural environment, just like NATO is. So in the last few months, obviously, there was that standing up necessity putting, literally the physical space together. And we've been doing that most of the time. But, a center like this also requires a good foundation administratively. And that is like a whole slew of procedures that go from safety and security to human resources to travel procedures. So we've been putting that together for the past few months. But the other thing that is very important for us is to be a accredited NATO Center of Excellence, and we're still not there yet. We're weeks away, hopefully, from that. But it gives us, we're not alone. There's 29 other Center of Excellence across that network that work on specific issues, which some of them overlap too. Paul talked about energy security. Well, there is a Center of Excellence on energy security, and this is probably one of our closest friends when it comes to future work, because as Paul said, the mitigating pillar of the action plan, a lot of its activities will fall on the energy security and how to come up with new ways on transitioning to new sources of energy. So a lot of collective work here with others, and there was that reaching out as well that we've done over the last 6 months, not only to COEs, but also think tanks, academic institutions, because one of our responsibilities is to develop or support training and educational tools. Governments, and we talked about Canada, but in our group of 12 nations, we have 5 of the 7 G7 nations. So UK, France, ourselves, Germany, and Italy are part of that group, and they have been extremely active recently on defining their approach from a defense perspective on climate change, energy security, and the likes. So there's a lot to learn there as well. And for us, as Bruno said, our mission is it's not to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good work that has been done at several levels, from, as I said, tactical, operational, and strategic. We have the COCOMs in the US that have been working on the impact of climate change for some time now, and they have good lessons learned to share as well. So our mission at the center is to become the hub for practitioners, both military and civilian, so that there is I wouldn't say a one-stop shop, but at least a center that has a good visibility on what's being done in that domain of climate security, and being able to translate it to answer some of the questions or some of the issues that were asked, not only by sponsoring nations, but also by people at NATO HQ when we're talking about implementing that action plan. This is a work that will require all hands on deck, and we're certainly part of that equation. So going forward, what it means, I have 4 main activities, I would say, that are more or less aligned to the action plan. And the first one is research and analysis and lessons learned. So we have people here that will be looking at some of the issues that are related to climate security, but also making sure that the scientists out there that are doing some good work are linked with the right people, and raise the visibility of their research and their conclusions when it comes to climate security, and how to make sure that we connect the dots from nation to nation. The second point is, as I said, training and education. So where can we support actual tools that are being developed as we speak, or even come up with the ones that we think are relevant. Paul talked about, pilots, helicopter pilots, but there's like tailored training as well that needs to be thought about in the future. Is it a role for CASCO? This is still to be determined, but there are things that we will do a needs analysis, and then we will identify where the resources of the center can be invested in the most efficient way. And then doctrine and experimentation is another domain that we will be active in, and this is supporting the efforts that are already underway or will be soon enough. And when the floodgates open on revising these doctrines and STANAG, I think it'll be enough work for everyone. So looking forward to be part of this the solutions there as well. And finally, one of the things, and maybe under the awareness and outreach more activities of the action plan, we have a dedicated branch that does outreach and engagement. So these workshops we're talking about, hopefully we will also be able to have those webinars that are so useful to share the knowledge. But also, we're hoping to host conference that will bring these thinkers, but also the military practitioners, not the ones that are talking and breathing climate security, the ones that need to make the decisions to implement the solutions that others have thought about and developed. So trying to, that bridge between the science research and the decision making is at the heart of what we're trying to do. And this bridge takes some time to build and needs to be strong enough. But certainly with the team I'll have here over the next year, we'll be able to create that capacity that NATO has been asked. Well, Canada has put forward, and NATO has responded positively to.
Great, thank you so much, and I really do appreciate as we near the end of the session that you make mention of the policy and practitioner bridging of the gap. Obviously, we haven't crafted any policy here today in the short time or really discussed like the complexity of the issue, but I think the big piece we did highlight is the need to speak beyond just the academic piece and really have that bridge between those policy and practitioners and see what the impacts are at the actual tactical level, such as Paul did mention. So that being said, I'm happy to go around the table now and have some parting items and come up from that. So if you have anything you'd like the audience to know about or speak to in terms of a platform, I'm opening that up to you now. I'd love to hear from you, Pauline, first. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Alex. And thank you for this discussion. It's as always really, very exciting to hear about these initiatives and how they are strengthening also, not only NATO per se, but really allied resolve. I think we can feel the impetus that there is among the climate security community and the NATO community in addressing these issues. And I think the kind of conversations like today really give a good overview of how all these considerations are interconnected and of the general awareness that they need to be addressed in an inclusive way and integrate systems thinking, as all panelists have mentioned, and it's really the kind of discussion that fosters hope regarding continuing action and collaboration going forward, and the very in-depth understanding of these risks and what they require. So, because I study the Arctic, I think the Arctic is just I see it just as a case in point of how climate security issues transcend boundaries and challenge national resources and resolve to address these issues, especially through cooperation among Arctic allies, but also beyond. And in this sense, I think that CASCO is of course a very promising platform to help mainstream the integration of climate considerations into Arctic military training and exercises, ensure interoperability, also to provide guidance to national forces to operate more sustainably in the North. So yes, there's really this kind of hope and stimulation happening. And we can see also this from Canada's new defense policy update that was released a couple of weeks ago with a very strong focus on the Arctic and investments announced and climate change is front and center, first paragraph of this policy. So I think this should be seen as a beginning. In Canada's case, we know that it's not enough because there's a huge capability gap. But still, we can see there's a shift in thinking, which went from a focus mostly on, soft security threats from climate change in the Canadian Arctic to the recognition of harder security threats, especially that the enforcement of territorial sovereignty may be at risk from certain impacts of climate change. So yes, I think all of this to say that I think there's a shift in thinking and understanding, and this is partly thanks to the impetus and all the work from NATO's climate security efforts writ large and allied collaboration on the topic.
Thank you for that, Pauline. Bruno, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Just quickly, maybe to say that if you're interested in the issue of working in climate security and interested in Climate Security Association of Canada, it's a young association. We're just over a year old. You can follow us on LinkedIn. We have a website. We've launched a student fellowship. So if you have students or if you're young professional, we'll be supporting that sort of work. So keep an eye out for that. We should have a newsletter ready also in the spring. Early summer, let's put it that way. So we're just trying to bring people together. So if you're interested, that's another way also of contributing to a community of interest, but also to all the work that needs to be done, as everyone today has underlined.
Great, thank you, Bruno, and I'm sure we'll be in touch more in the future in that regard. Paul, over to you for parting shots.
Thank you. I know this is perhaps traditionally the time in the conversation where we announce some new initiative or some new piece of work that we're going to undertake together. But I think what we've mostly done, as Bruno has wisely pointed out, is show how much work we've already identified to do. And certainly on our part, that mainstreaming effort at NATO, that work to incorporate effective climate change mitigation and adaptation into everything that we do, is a long-term project of which we keep discovering new details and new commitments. And that's what makes me so thankful that we have efforts like this one to expand our learning, to build our community out, to help bring in new perspectives and build the popular awareness of the scope of climate security problems and challenges and the steps that we know we need to take to address them, because that's how we summon the will and the resources and the expertise that is absolutely essential to get this work done. I'm very happy to have been able to participate in this work. I'm extremely keen to work with the CASCO as it continues to stand up as such an important enabling capability. I'm thankful for Canada for its efforts to support the center and stand it up so quickly. And that is all in service of what I continue to say is the biggest and most complex and most fascinating security challenge we've ever dealt with. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. Metzer, over to you to conclude. We really do appreciate it.
No, thanks again, Alex, and maybe an observation and a comment as we finish this webinar. I've been in position for 7 months now, so I've talked to a lot of people in the community, and I can tell you with confidence that this is a thriving group of individuals that are really dedicated to the issue at play. But what I would want to point out is that the challenge anyway for us and maybe for people on that panel as well is to go beyond that community, jump that wall and convince others of the importance and the urgency of it all. So if I had a parting comment would be don't be shy to feel uncomfortable and go talk to people that may need a little bit more convincing when it comes to climate change and security. And it's clearly how we try to approach this, and we want to shape the message so that they can accept and be convinced and take action. And hopefully all of these efforts that have been put in this topic so far and will be enough to convince. But I am extremely proud to be part of this community, but I think we need now to pass on the message to a wider audience. But thank you, Alex, for this panel today.
Great, thank you. So for all our speakers here, thanks again for coming to the webinar. The community is richer in knowledge here based on today's contributions. And for guests and viewers, we hope you've taken something away from the webinar today. We remain open to foster discussion pertaining to the items, and you can further engage online through our IPD website, as well as various other forums such as the Climate Security Association of Canada, the Center for Climate Security in Washington, D.C., and of course, CASCO itself. That concludes. We do appreciate everyone's time, particularly the speakers, as part of their busy days. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you.